We have a wonderful staff, not staff, but we have a wonderful team here speaking, led by our moderator, Robert McIsaac, who's a longtime friend and a great thought leader, and excited to hear from the rest of the panelists. So with that, we'll get started. I'll invite the panelists on stage to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. Everyone in a food coma? I hope not. Well, welcome to Sunnyvale, California, a place that I don't live, but where I spend a remarkable amount of time for a guy who actually does live in North Carolina. My name is Rob McIsaac. As Hutch said, we have had a very long-term relationship with Plug and Play, which we're very excited about. I have been at this in the insurance and benefits space for 100 years. No, not exactly, but actually for 40. Began my career working at Prudential Insurance in the group health insurance world at a time when technology was creating a very significant change in how the business was done. Ironically, some of those systems that I had a chance to work on back in the late 1970s are still in production in some places today, so that's a little bit of a frightening thought. But there was a technology change and an organizational change and a cultural change that took place at that time, which many don't remember. We're facing many of those same opportunities and challenges today, even as the world of benefits changes in some pretty fundamental ways. And as you heard this morning, conversations about how even the nature of work may well be changing as we face a world where there are going to be now 4 different living generations in the workforce at the same time. So it's a very interesting world in which we all live, and one that's really important to get ready for. Just a couple of things that I think are fascinating. When you think about the changes that are taking place today, I worked for Prudential Insurance in the 1990s. We were the 4th largest health insurance company in the country. Our conclusion was we were never going to make any money at that business, and that the idea that we were going to lose money on every case and make it up on volume was at its core a flawed strategy. Today, if you look at the 4th largest health insurance company in the country, it is Aetna. They bought Prudential's business, and they merged with CVS. That is a huge change and has implications across the board as we think about data and knowledge and how we turn data into actionable information and significant potential implications for competitors. Today, Amazon announced that they're going to be accepting HSA and FSA payments for things that are medically related that are bought through their marketplace. That is another change that would have been very hard to imagine until relatively recently, but it suggests more players, more change, more things that we all need to be thinking about. So it's an exciting time. It's a time when people should be very planful, and we think it's a time when people should be thinking about the places that they're going to make strategic and targeted investments. So a little bit more about me. I have worked for Novarica, which is a technology research and advisory company, for the last 7 years. We are focused on all forms of insurance in the North American market. We conveniently define North America as the United States and Canada. Mexico is great. It's just a different operating language, different business culture, so we happen to choose not to operate there. Today we count 350 carriers in North America as part of a research council that we manage, and we have 120 carriers that have advisory relationships with us. Prior to joining Novarica, I spent more than 30 years working in industry as a senior leader at companies like Prudential, Guardian, Nationwide, a subsidiary of a company called GenRe today. And I did a 5-year detour to be the CIO for a top 50 U.S. bank, which conveniently I took that role as the financial crisis was starting. We were a healthy bank during that period, did 9 acquisitions in 18 months. M&A is something that we certainly see a lot of today happening in the industry. It was an exciting time, and I would want to refer back just as a thought from that before the other panelists introduce themselves. As you and as we think about technology and the implications and impact across financial services, across benefits, across those 4 generations, one of the things that's very, very clear is that technology tends to advance fastest in places where you have the highest transaction volumes and the lowest switching costs. So for people who are working in the insurance world, that banking crack is actually a pretty important one, because banking tends to operate 5 years ahead of the leading edge of the insurance world, which frequently is the property and casualty space, and 10 years ahead of the life and annuity space. So for some people, if it feels like it's 2009 again, that's because it is if you weren't in banking, right? And so there are many concepts that we were working with a decade ago that are now making themselves very much felt in the insurance world. And by the way, banks and retailers have had the opportunity to create the notion of what a truly great customer experience is. So reinventing that is probably less important than understanding what really works well there and being able to slipstream things from peripheral lines of business or peripheral industries. And so we think that's a really important concept as people think about how they're going to market with things. There are completely different things to worry about as you're looking at some of the data, but some of the experiences have already been pretty well framed. So it's a real pleasure to be here in Northern California today, and I would like to turn to Rick, ask him to introduce himself. We'll go down the line. Folks will introduce themselves, tell you where they're from, and then we'll get into the meat of the matter.
Thanks, Robert. My name is Rick Koo, and I was Mercer. How many of you have you heard of Mercer? All right, so I'm in the right group. I was at a conference yesterday. We had 1,000 or so participants. I asked, how many heard of Mercer? I got 3 hands. So depending on, most of you know Mercer, and I've been with Mercer 3 years, and part of the digital group, which is a new group that we created, really focused on digital transformation, technology, innovation, to really change not just the benefit, but also really the entire HR landscape. And just a little plug for Mercer, right? We are probably the leading employee benefit consulting globally. We're in 130 countries. We have over 20,000 consultants, and so we obviously cover a very wide space. So we have very, very wide global footprint. We understand, how the carriers are in terms of maturity and how we deal with each carrier and so on. And prior to Mercer, I was a vice president of EIS, and we actually built software for property and casualty and group benefit. I think I probably work with some of you in the audience, and so happy to be here and maybe share some thoughts.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks for Plug and Play to invite me here. This is Ashish Tolia. I'm with Delta Dental of California. Delta Dental of California is one of 39 Delta Dentals, and as California, the entity I belong to, we are present in 15 states and DC in the US, serve about 36.5 million members in the dental arena, and by way of that, we're probably one of the largest in the dental space and in the private arena at least. So my role within Delta Dental is to lead their investments and partnerships arm. I was hired about a year ago. My background is entirely, minus these last 14 months, is automotive and industrial. So I'm very much of a newbie here, and as far as the industry domain goes, but was hired to set up their investment and partnership arm and develop focus around what can we do in open innovation to leverage that to accelerate our own journey for Delta Dental of California and how we want to transform ourselves. So that's the role, the mandate that I carry. I have a small and mighty team over the course of the last 14 months that has built up. We've closed 4 investments and done 2 partnerships. And so we're progressing at a good clip. And that's a little bit about me. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Louise Short. I'm a physician by training, and I'm the national clinical leader for Brown & Brown. Brown & Brown is the 5th largest insurance intermediary in the U.S., so we're a brokerage and consulting firm, $2 billion firm, focused on P&C and employee benefits. And Brown & Brown has kind of put a big bet going forward on the employee benefits part of the business. So my role is really to start and build a population health practice for Brown & Brown. I advise employers on strategies to improve health, decrease costs, and improve productivity, as well as attract and retain talent. We've also started an innovation hub, and part of the function of the innovation hub is to understand what's out in the marketplace in terms of digital health solutions and care management solutions. And it's like the parade of vendors in front of our clients. Every day, different vendors are knocking on their door, and so we're trying to make sense of the marketplace for clients and really advise them on how different solutions fit into their strategy. Previous to Brown & Brown, I've been there for about a year. I was at another small firm that begins with an M and ends with an R, which Rick may have mentioned, for 6 years. And prior to that, I was with carriers for several years. So I spent 4 years at United and 9 years at Anthem. I also did a stint at Healthways, which some of you may recognize as now ShareCare. And previous to that, I was in clinical practice and also worked at the Centers for Disease Control. So I live in Atlanta, and it's great to be here with you all today.
Awesome. Well, thanks to the panelists. Thanks for you joining us. You know, one of the things that's a reality is the nature of work is changing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, no doubt. But also the nature of how benefits are delivered or what the benefits are. You go back to the beginning of my career, and benefits tended to be guaranteed things. They always came through the employer, it seemed. Were pretty strict lanes in which people operated and pretty clear lines of who was delivering that. One of the things I'd like to ask the panelists, starting with Rick, is what do you see as being the evolving nature of both what employers and plan members, employees, are looking for as we look out over the next 3 or 5 years? What sorts of changes in benefits are emerging?
I think you mentioned it, right? I think you talk about Amazon now, take HSA. We see that, right? We see that the employee wants to have more control over the plans, right? That's one thing we see. So we see them picking the HSA, and I think, and I saw an article this morning. 2018 is, it was the peak of the HSA, right? And folks even use HSA as a retirement tool, right? They can use that. So we see a lot of, and with a high deductible, they can manage their plans, right? And I think one of the things that one of the papers that we published is that I think that where the industry is going and employee wants it, they want more outcome-based, right? They just pay for, fee for service, right? You go to the doctor, you pay a fee. But if you have something you want some outcome, like any business, right? Focus on more outcome or evidence, right? You want to see, what's it worth for me to go to a doctor. So, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about millennial, right? I mean, I think the demographic is changing quite a bit too, right? That's affecting the population, and so I think the more control over their plan, that's one thing that we do see, and so that puts a challenge to the employer, right, to give a mix of benefits, right, beyond the traditional mix of benefit that we offer, but also be creative on how we really incent our employee to buy a certain plan that they may not think of, right? And so we can talk a little later, but I think all boiled down to is data, right? You need data to do kind of the kind of care that they're looking for.
Great. Sheesh?
So definitely agree with a lot of what Rick already shared. I think the one that I'll add from a dental standpoint is we're trying to figure out how the engagement points of our member population are going to change over time. And with consumerization, what their preferences are with the profiles that they carry, what does that front door look like? And how do we carry them through that journey? And so whether it is through the employees and the benefit population, but also for the uninsured, right? As we think about a care and coverage company, we are also thinking about what kind of coverage can we provide to the current uninsured population, which is huge. And in the US, there are about 70 million people who do not have dental insurance. And so that is definitely going to evolve over time. There is a big opportunity there. And I think there is one for us as well in terms of figuring out what are those coverage models based on those engagement points, a lot based on those consumer-centric, data-driven opportunities that we will build on. And I think that's what we're trying to uncover in the next few years. Yeah.
Thank you. So as you kind of look at the landscape and we're talking about high deductible plans, I do think that employers have come to a point where they're realizing they can't just cost shift onto members and that they need to have other strategies that include managing the population. And if we look at the biggest pain points for employers today, they're high-cost claimants, specialty drugs, and engagement. Those are three of the top pain points. So And then, there's sort of a coincidental trend of changes in how healthcare is delivered. So if I look at employee benefits today, I think I see 4 things in the marketplace that are really going to affect the types of benefits that employers are going to choose and need to deliver. One is virtual care. Virtual care is changing the landscape, and I think in 10 years it's going to change tremendously. I think the gentleman from Sutter was saying 64% of all encounters could be virtual. And we're going to see that more and more, both in the medical side and also behavioral health. So that's one trend, and employers are going to have to figure out what kinds of benefits to provide. Today, many employers provide telemedicine as a benefit. The uptake isn't as much as we would like, so that engagement really needs to increase, and the strategies to engage people need to change a bit. But I think that's one of the big trends. The other one is, and Rick mentioned this, kind of pay for quality. So pay for quality, pay for performance. Instead of paying physicians for the number of services, we're going to pay for outcomes. And that's going to change employer benefits too. I mean, first of all, employers are going to need to understand what the carrier networks are and what the carrier contracts are and what's happening with measurement of performance. But second of all, employers are now starting to say, hey, we're going to contract directly. We're going to contract for complex services that are rare and expensive, like joints and knees and bariatric surgery. I don't know if you all saw the article in the Harvard Business Review, I think it was last week, about Walmart and Centers of Excellence, and a couple of other large employers were in there. I've had the opportunity to work with several large employers on direct contracts with different provider groups, and Pacific Business Group on Health also has a Centers of Excellence network. It's kind of a collaborative for employers where they have a few conditions in there. So that's going to be something else that employers are going to have to look at. And not only are they going to have to provide these benefits, but they're going to have to educate people on how to use them, figure out if they're going to incentivize them. So there's a whole area there on pay for performance that employers are going to have to deal with. The third trend, I think, is digital health. And we're sitting here talking about it today, but I think it really is critical. We were visiting another group, BC, the other day that is focused on digital health, and $8 billion spent on digital health in the last since 2011, which is amazing. And the deals are increasing, the money spent is increasing, and what we're seeing now is that employers want to add these point solutions to their universe. And the way we usually advise them is take a look at your cost drivers and figure out what your pain points are, and then pick solutions that fall into that category. So we have a lot of employers looking at behavioral health solutions, online behavioral health, cognitive behavioral health therapy, resiliency training. Also a lot of solutions aimed at metabolic syndrome. Many of you may know Omada, which was one of the first digital health companies that's been very successful in decreasing the prevalence of metabolic syndrome, and now working with public programs as well, as you mentioned. In the area of infertility and women's health, there are several different digital solutions. So this is something that employers are really going to have to consider and work with as we go forward. I think the last issue is the complexity of the benefits universe. And so you can have as many programs as you want, but you got to get people to engage. And it's hard to get people to engage because they don't even understand what's available. And so what we're seeing now is the development of these navigation and advocacy services. This has been happening probably for the last 10 years. And we're seeing more and more large employers and even middle market employers migrate to companies like Accolade and Quantum that provide customized concierge service coupled with clinical in a very different model than the health plans have traditionally done it. The health plans are kind of trying to catch up to this. And then we're seeing companies that provide a lot of analytics and digital navigation, personalized messaging. Someone up here before was talking about if there's an emergency or poor air quality or something's happening, your insurance company doesn't message you. Well, these companies are using all of that data to message employees and their families personally. And that's going to become a bigger and bigger trend as they're going to use more AI, companies like eVive and others that you may have heard of. So I think those are 4 major things that employers are going to have to deal with in the benefits universe in the next several years.
Louise, that's great. And Ashish, maybe we could just stop with you. And from a Delta Dental standpoint, or from your standpoint as you think about this, one of the things that we see a lot of is an increasing awareness on the part of employers or plan sponsors that they have a stake in financial wellness and the health wellness of their employees, which can introduce different ways of engagement, different demands for data. But are you seeing examples where you can see that companies, employers are using these as opportunities to better align both awareness of what's out there with approaches to getting better outcomes that make everybody a winner?
So I think from our standpoint, we are trying to uncover as to what does that match look like for ourselves in terms of providing a product or service that is relevant for the consumer, regardless of their needs or where they are at in their life stage, and figuring out how we inform them about it as well as deliver the solution. We are approaching it almost 2 or 3 different ways in terms of just the information piece and the delivery piece. So one of the things that we're doing is we're working on this initiative which we call Delivery of Care, Access to Care, in terms of leveraging digital health solutions and helping provide a suite of opportunities and solutions, engagement points, again, front doors for people to engage on, and providing that regardless of what your needs are, you have something that is conveniently available for you based on your preference, your style, and so on. The other thing that we're doing is we can't do this by ourselves, and so in terms of how do we channel the awareness, and again, the delivery model, we're thinking about our provider base and thinking about dentists. And there are 180,000 dentists in the country. And as Delta Dental of California, we have about 74,000 of them in our network. So what can we do via that channel? And get to the employees, get to the members. And there is a theme that we call there call it dentist as a customer. And essentially think about how can we help the dentist help us and eventually help the consumer in trying to deliver those models and the quality-centric, value-based care and outcome orientation that we need. So those are a couple of ways that we are approaching it, and ultimately trying to figure out what is that collection of products and or services that are relevant at that stage for the need, that are easy to enroll into, easy to utilize, and are preventative oriented, and that's our focus here.
That's awesome. I'd like to pick up on something you mentioned, this notion of 180,000 dentists. One of the things that's really interesting is as we look at the participants in the ecosystem, the nature of the roles that they play starts to change. I'm not even going to ask how many people in this room were alive in 1980, but if you do remember 1980, in the United States, there were 250,000 people who worked in bank branches. So 40 years later, how many people do you think work in bank branches? If you said 250,000, you'd be right. But think about what's happened to the country in the last 39 years. It's a dramatically larger population. The jobs that those people have is fundamentally different than what it was then. And the technology reliance that they have is dramatically different. So the populations, the book of business, if you will, that they're able to handle is greatly changed. And that has implications in this area as well as we start to think about the suppliers and the providers and the places where technology can impact things. Rick, you mentioned HSAs and picked up on that. I'd just like to go back to that for a minute because I have to admit one of the things I didn't fully appreciate when HSAs came along was that when managed the right way, it really was like having an extra part to your 401k. You could treat it like a retirement piece. I know my kids who are in their 30s, very much focused on what are the right kinds of benefits for them, didn't really appreciate nor understand that. And I'm just wondering from a Mercer standpoint or from your standpoint, are you seeing things that companies should do, can do, that can help better educate people who are their employees around the benefits that they actually have? And are there better ways of delivering some of that education?
Let me answer it differently, right? I think, this is probably more Rick than Mercer, right? I think the older generation, they look at health insurance like car insurance, right? You buy insurance to prevent, catastrophe or a major event, right? But I think the the millennial, Gen X, Gen Y, they look at that very differently. They look at more from the wellness side, right? It's not just, hey, someone going to get sick and I got to cover that. Is, how do we focus on wellness? And really, from technology standpoint, the way I look at it is that we have been, talking about 1980, we've been very good building this whole system record, right, over the years. Very good at it, right? Policies and, eligibility and also on. I think we just started to build this layer of engagement, right? Understanding a customer you talk about, understanding the provider, the health provider, dentists or doctors. And that's critical, right? And I think we are just catching up on that. Understand that interaction between doctor and patient is going to be key. And then I think the third layer, the way I look at it, is your system of insights. Because with that engagement with the system record, then you can start creating insights. And that's where the power is, right? That's what you talk about is that how do folks really using their benefit plans? And how do they, are they really using it right? And how do we influence in the decision and or even, making some decision for them, right? I think that's where, the disruption will come. That's where the startup in the room, that's the opportunity that you have, right? That you have that opportunity to see is where that edge can be, right? Because, I think different carrier and a different level of maturity, but I think the engagement is going to be key.
So at some level, it's a little bit like what Amazon does, right? Smart people like you have read this or done this. Think about that from
Netflix, right? Netflix model.
Perfect. So she's just picking up on that. We had actually somebody talked about this a little bit this morning. So the largest living generation has been millennials for a while. Next year, millennials will represent 50% of the U.S. labor force. But what's another interesting stat that's not been talked about very much is that by 2025, millennials are projected to represent 75% of the U.S. labor force. Turns out my part of the baby boom cohort is actually dramatically smaller than the first half. And so as my part of the generation moves through the latter stages of their careers, the percentage of population participation is going to drop off quickly. Not that I'm going anywhere anytime soon, but as employers think about this, you're going to potentially have older baby boomers, younger baby boomers who act differently, Gen Xers. You're going to have millennials, and the first Gen Zs are graduating from college, depending on how you do the math. Now, what do you think the implications of that are from a benefit standpoint, and are there things that various participants in the ecosystem are going to need to think about?
So the one thing that comes top of mind is the complexity that's going to come with it, and multiply that with the expectations that they're going to have, especially the millennials and the Gen Zs. And as we think back to what is that, going back to what I said earlier in terms of what are those delivery models and what are those solutions that we cater to the life stages they're in. We're trying to uncover where are those entry points. I'll give an example about the millennials and the Gen Z potential population that comes into the labor force. From a dentist standpoint or oral health standpoint, what we're realizing is, one of the things we realize is the millennial generation cares more about their smile than about the oral health. Well, at least initially, right? And so that becomes an interesting door opener, if you will. So when we think about applying digital health or telemedicine and Reinvented in a company in teledentistry, one of the solutions that was quite exciting for us about that was it was bringing consumers in, it was attracting consumers by giving them a smile score. And then as part of the journey was also taking them through a clinical evaluation. And that just made it that much easier for a millennial to look at, yes, I got a beautiful smile, or what do I need to do to get a beautiful smile? And here's a clinical report that tells me what I need to do next. And by the way, I also get a cost estimate, and they love transparency, right? So, and so we think about those solutions and how they match up to the labor force and their requirements and their needs. That's something that we keep in mind as we go forward. Yeah.
That's brilliant. I love the smile score, by the way. Louise, anything from your standpoint?
So I think a few things in terms of millennials, and we've talked about some of this already. I mean, I think financial wellness is important to them. Really, it's student loan repayment. I mean, kids come out of school with so much debt today that I think that's a huge concern. As well, you know, virtual care, I've already talked about it a lot, but that's going to be really important. Accenture just did a study, 8,000 consumers on sort of digital health, and what they found was that millennials and Generation Z preferred retail clinics, virtual care. The primary care relationship really isn't a big priority for them. Maybe as they age it will be, but there's a very different expectation of care in these younger generations. The other piece I think is really important for millennials is behavioral health. There's an increasing prevalence of anxiety and depression and suicide within the millennials and Generation Z. We've all heard about it in colleges and campuses, and younger people increasing prevalence. And a lot of the anxiety is having to do with technology, actually, and the fact that we can get everything immediately. I mean, I read a statistic that the average teenager has an attention span of 8 seconds, and a goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds. So, you know, all I could picture was the goldfish, you know, waiting to eat that piece of food that in the tank and thinking, wow, like, you know, a kid can't even do that today. So there's going to be a real issue with behavioral health, and it already is happening in the workforce. And so I think employers, every employer that I talk to is very, very interested in what are the solutions, what are the spectrum of solutions. And there's a big access problem in behavioral health. I don't think anybody has solved that. Some companies have tried, and that's going to be increasingly an important problem. The other thing is EAP. EAPs today have morphed. You know, so the traditional EAP that just kind of does crisis management and a few sessions, now there's a lot of work-life support, caregiver support, and all kinds of other services that are getting incorporated. So even like Lyra is kind of a new type of EAP that incorporates virtual visits. So there's a lot going on in the behavioral health space. The other thing we haven't mentioned is genomics, and I think that's really important. You know, there's more and more testing. Some of our clients have actually covering now genetic testing, so they're covering like 23andMe for their population. And so that's where we can really figure out what are the risks, get people into appropriate counseling. But also we're seeing now some different types of policies like covering genomic testing if someone has cancer and genomic consultation, which is really important because, I mean, the therapies can be much more targeted and effective, and you can spare people from getting ineffective therapies with a lot of side effects. So I think that's another thing that in the millennial generation will be much more prevalent. People will expect to be able to get this type of genetic testing.
That's awesome. I'm going to struggle to get rid of the goldfish thing for a while. But so combining a couple of those thoughts, though, this notion of how people consume information as well as the messaging that's important to them, one of the most fundamental things that I would tell you that is different between banks and insurance companies is that banks tend to think about the world from the outside looking in. They're voracious consumers of data about how customers and prospects think about them, look at them, and consume services. Insurance companies in the main tend to think about the world from the inside looking out. So I'll come up with the best answer, and then I'll launch it to great fanfare and then potentially be surprised when nobody actually comes. As we look at consuming information, one of my lessons learned when I was a CIO at a bank was that we had to message people differently. And my example was we wanted to get people to adopt the use of electronic statements. When we went out, millennials were more than happy to accept electronic statements, recognizing the value from a green standpoint, doing environmental things that were positive. Baby boomers thought we meant emailing them the electronic statements and were not willing to accept them at all. So we had to change the message to say, no, do you want a more secure way of delivering the information, at which point they would, oh, sure. And they would adopt at the same rates as millennials with a completely different message. So I love the smile factor as an element in that. We are now looking at a world where we are going to have these generations coexisting in the environment. Employers and others in the ecosystem are going to have to figure this out. So really briefly as we come to the end of our session, and we will be available for questions afterwards, but are there technology implications that you see coming over the next 5 or 6 years that you think people are going to have to be ready to invest in order to be able to get the outcomes that you or we would like? And Louise, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, I think multimodal communication is going to be really key. And I mean, if you look at sort of carriers and the way that they've engaged people in care management or clinical programs over the years, it's like we call you at dinner time. Well, they're figuring out that's not going to work anymore. And so, you know, they're having to invest in text, communicating through apps, email, whatever is sort of personal preference. But I think there'll be many technologies that will come in the next several years. I mean, if you look at just social media, Facebook, only people like my generation, baby boomers, are using Facebook now. You know, my kids are using Instagram and Snapchat and whatever the next best thing is. And I think that's going to happen in healthcare too, that we're going to see modes of communication that we don't even have now that are going to be engaging people in care.
I think I'll take an enabling aspect to it in terms of from a carrier standpoint what we need to do. And I think aside from the fact that we are in healthcare and we're, you know, many of us are, you know, dealing with people's lives here. Safety first also from a standpoint of data. As we go out and work with our consumers, utilize their data, message to them about utilizing their data, being ethical and transparent about it and so on, we need to also invest heavily in protecting that data. And I think that is one thing that I just wanted to underscore from a technology standpoint. As we go in that direction, what's important, and that indirect messaging of protecting the data is very vital as well.
I think for me, I mean, there's the four area that I know many of us are looking at. One is IoT, right? Is how you capture data in time, right? That's one thing. Interactions, and we all see, you know, iWatch and so on. And then it's all about data. Collect the data. And I said again before, insights, right? How do you create insight? And I think, you know, this is something we all dabble with. I'm not sure how well played out is blockchain, right? And I know many of the folks in the room probably dabble with blockchain. There's just somewhere in the blockchain that we think that you will be relevant in the healthcare benefit and how we exchange data and how we can give consumer or employee the power owning that data, right? And so I think those four areas that I think we'll focus on.
Awesome. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists for enjoying what was clearly the fastest 35 minutes of my day. Appreciate being with you all. We will be available to talk at the next break if you'd like. So thank you.